Keisha, don't you have classes?
Yeah, I went to one already, and I'm skipping the rest, Grammy. I'll make it up. Don't worry, okay?
All rise. Hear ye, hear ye. This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Winston Harding presiding. Be seated.
Clerk, call the case.
This is a continuation of the State versus Edward Quartermain, docket PC 77992. All are present.
Mr. Stannis, are you ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Myrna Slaughter.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I surely do.
Please be seated.
Order in the court.
Would you state your name and address, please?
Myrna Slaughter. I live at 1045 West 14th Street, New York City.
How long have you lived there?
I got the place, fall of 87.
And prior to that time?
I was out in L.A. a while trying to get work. I was an actress.
Have you ever lived in the Port Charles area?
Yes, for about 2 years, starting around the middle of 1973.
Can you tell us how you came to establish residence here?
Sure. Like I said, I was an actress. And at that time, I'd been doing some stage work in New York City. I work under the name Lola Lamont. Nobody wants to hire a girl named Slaughter. Anyway, I didn't get the breaks. And except for a couple of off Broadway bombs and some extra work on a few soaps, I hadn't worked up much of a resume. But finally, I landed a part in a bus and truck of an old musical. A road show. You tour the whole country, including the Boondocks. Oh, not that Port Charles was that.
Then you did perform in Port Charles?
Yes, I did. And here's where I got my big break. Or at least it would have been if things had gone the way they should have. But that's life. What are you going to do?
Go on, please.
Right. Sure. The break was, I met an angel of a guy while I was playing here who thought I had real potential as an actress. And he bankrolled a Broadway show with me in the lead. But I bombed again. I just couldn't seem to put myself together with the right material. Anyway, my friend was sweet as pie about the whole fiasco. And because I was so depressed, he invited me to come stay in Port Charles for a while. That seemed like a swell idea. Because, the fact is, we'd both gotten quite a case on each other. So my friend found an apartment for me, and I left New York, no regrets, and came up here.
Would you be willing to tell us the name of your generous friend?
Yes, it was Jack Boland.
Did you see Mr. Boland frequently during your stay in Port Charles?
That was kind of the point. I mean, Jack needed a place where he could relax and unwind and just be his natural self. He was a real bigwig, in, down, and out in that hoity-toity social circle he ran in.
So, Mr. Boland spent a good deal of time unwinding in that apartment he'd rented for you.
As much as he could. We'd just sit up real late, jawing about this and that.
During those talks, did he ever discuss his business life?
Oh, sure, he told me all about it. He was a real wheeler-dealer. Very smooth, but very, very sharp.
Miss Slaughter, did Jack Boland ever mention the name Frank Smith in connection with any of his business dealings?
All the time. He was real tight with Frank.
And how about the name Bradley Ward? Did that ever come up?
Yes. Well, you couldn't be in Port Charles those days without hearing the name Bradley Ward. He was in the news all the time, opposing this, fighting for that. That wretched reformer, Jack used to call him. I heard him speak once. He was fabulous.
So you were well aware of the conflict between Bradley Ward and Jack Boland?
Jack let off a lot of steam about it to me. Dr. Ward was a big problem for him and his partners.
I see. Do you recall the night of June 30th, 1974?
I surely do. Every bit of it, like a movie in my head.
How is it you can remember a date nearly 20 years ago so clearly?
Because of what happened that night. Or I guess it would be the morning, wouldn't it? July the 1st.
Order in the court.
Miss Slaughter, would you describe for us the events that took place in the early morning hours of July 1st, 1974?
Okay. Jack had been over earlier in the evening, but he'd gone home. And I didn't expect him back. But around 4 a.m., I woke up with the sound of his key in the door. So I got up and came out, and there he was in the living room in his shirt sleeves, pacing. He was really wired. I asked what was wrong, but he wasn't ready to tell me. So I just let him pace like that and made us both a drink. I set them down and went to hang up his jacket. He tossed on the couch, and when I started to pick it up, I felt this big, heavy lump in the pocket. And I thought, what the dickens? And then a gun fell out.
Order.
It plopped down right on the sofa pillow, and I just stood there and stared at it. Jack tried to cover up, said he'd gotten the gun for protection, just in case.
In case of... Did he specify?
He made out that one of his business deals had gone bad, and some fellow was hopping mad over it and making threats. But I looked him in the eye and said, honey, I don't buy it.
How did he respond?
He hemmed and hawed. He knew he couldn't pull the wool over my eyes. I knew him too well. I could see he was hurting. And something else I'd never seen before. He was scared. So I said, Jack Boland, you've been the best friend I've ever had. And if I can't be the same to you, there's no sense my even being here. Finally, he broke down and told me the whole story.
Can you relay that story to the court now?
I'll do my best. Jack told me that Edward Quartermain had called a meeting way late that night and asked him and Frank and Lee to back off of Bradley Ward and let Edward handle the problem himself. Jack didn't like it, told him no. He thought they had the advantage and wanted to press it. Edward lost his temper, warned them to leave it up to him, and walked out.
So far, your account corroborates what we've heard about that meeting. But we've also heard testimony that later that night, while Frank and Lee and Jack were still talking, there was another phone call. Now, Mr. Boland testified that that call came from Edward Quartermain. Did Jack Boland tell you something differently?
There was a call, he said, but not from Edward. It was from Bradley Ward wanting to meet with him right away.
Order in this court! Order in the court!
Jack!
Order in this court!
But Jack didn't tell his associates.
I guess not, because he went to meet Bradley Ward all alone in his mother's backyard, and they talked a long time.
Did he tell you what was said?
Dr. Ward told Jack that he and his buddies could stuff their blackmail. He told his mother, which was the worst part for him, and he wasn't about to back down now. Jack tried to put some more pressure on him, but Bradley wouldn't knuckle under. Instead, he threatened to tell the whole story from his own pulpit before Jack and his cronies could go public with it. He knew he'd lose everything, but it was the last blow he could hand them, and they'd go down with him.
Did Jack Boland describe his reaction to Reverend Dr. Ward's intention?
Yes. He told me he took that gun and shot Bradley Ward and killed him.
Order in the court! Order in this court! I will have silence in this court! Order! I will have order or I'll clear this courtroom.
Miss Slaughter, do you happen to know where Jack Boland got the gun he used to kill Bradley Ward?
Objection, that's conjecture.
Sustained.
I'll rephrase. Miss Slaughter, when Jack Boland told you he'd shot and killed Bradley Ward, did he say anything about a gun?
Yeah. He told me he snitched the gun from Edward Quartermain's gun case the night they all had a meeting at his house out there on Long Island. See, what had happened was Frank and Jack had a powwow by themselves about Bradley. They were both afraid Bradley's high ideals would get in the way of his common sense. Frank told Jack he'd better be ready with a plan B.
Are you saying that Jack Boland took orders from Frank Smith?
Not exactly, but Frank wasn't the kind you said no to. He also knew how to keep his hands clean.
So, Jack took the gun with the intention of eliminating Bradley Ward if need be.
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for conclusion from the witness.
I'll withdraw the question. Did Jack Boland tell you anything more about the weapon?
Just that now he had to get it back into Edward's collection because he figured the police would be investigating the murder. He was hoping he couldn't trace a World War II gun, but he said if they did, it'd have to be Edward's tough luck.
Thank you, Miss Slaughter. Your witness.
Miss Slaughter, you testified that Jack Boland told you that it was Bradley Ward who called him in the early morning hours of July 1st. Yet, Mr. Boland himself told this court that it was Edward Quartermain. How do you account for this discrepancy?
Well, what was he going to tell you? Bradley called and he met him and he killed him?
But essentially, that is your account, and Mr. Boland, now dead, certainly can't contradict you or speak to his own defense now, can he?
I'm telling you the truth.
The truth? Yeah. And how would you define that?
The truth?
Mm-hmm.
What's true? What's real? What happened?
And when we have two varying accounts of that alleged truth, how are we to distinguish between the two? Whose truth are we to accept?
Jack had a reason to lie to you. I don't.
No? Uh-huh. Now, let's examine what you've told us so far. For example, about your brief career as an actress.
It wasn't so brief. It just wasn't so hot. I worked my tail off, but I couldn't make it happen. So what?
Well, so if you were unable to make ends meet with your life in the theater, how did you support yourself?
Same as lots of actors do, part-time and temp jobs, waitress, receptionist, this and that.
Uh-huh. And would this and that include work in an establishment known as the Pass Key Club?
Yes, I waited tables there.
Would you tell us about that?
Objection. Counsel is wandering into irrelevancy.
Speaks to the character of the witness, Your Honor.
I'll allow a brief description, Miss Slaughter.
Don't know what there is to tell. It was a private club. I was a waitress.
Well, tell us about the working conditions. For example, were you required to wear a particular mode of dress?
Yeah. Well, a lot of places have some kind of uniform.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, isn't that uniform? Let's talk about that for a second. Wasn't it a very skimpy, revealing costume?
It was a little on the brief side. The boys, the members, liked that. It was no big deal. Wasn't like we took our clothes off.
Now, did you or your colleagues at the Passkey ever socialize with members outside of the club?
Once in a while, I dated somebody. Most of us did.
And did any of the men you dated ever give you money?
You mean like a present?
However you wish to characterize it.
Let me think. Well, once, this nice fellow from Chattanooga paid an overdue phone bill for me. And another time, a guy loaned me money to pay my rent. Those types are loaded. It's no skin off their nose.
Uh-huh. Now, this acting job that you mentioned, the one that brought you here to Port Charles, isn't it a fact that you got that part through a producer who was also a member of the Passkey Club?
Yes, but I got it because I was a good actress.
Oh, I believe that, ma'am. All of us are seeing that here today.
Objection.
Sustained. The clerk will strike Mr. Schultz's last comment.
Miss Slaughter, you've told us that following your Broadway disaster that Jack Boland financed for you, he suggested that you take a break from show business, and he brought you here to Port Charles.
That's right.
Wasn't he bringing you here, in fact, to become his mistress?
Jack was my friend.
And you jumped at the chance because at last your history of taking money from wealthy men was about to pay off with a big job security.
Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness.
Mr. Schultz.
I'm about to clarify this whole line of questioning, Your Honor.
You may proceed cautiously.
Is history repeating itself here today, Miss Slaughter?
Don't know what you mean.
Well, isn't it a fact that your airfare to Port Charles and your hotel bill are all being paid again by a generous, wealthy man, Edward Quartermain?
I couldn't have gotten here otherwise. I had to come and tell the truth.
For what price, Miss Slaughter? What else did Mr. Quartermain promise you in recompense for your version of the truth?
Objection.
Overruled.
How much, Miss Slaughter?
Nothing. He didn't promise me anything. All he said was he'd be very grateful.
Isn't it a fact, Miss Slaughter, that you've made a career not as an actress, although it's clear that you're talented in that regard, but in accepting the gratitude of wealthy men?
That isn't fair.
Why then should we believe anything that you tell us on this witness stand when it's perfectly clear?
Stop tormenting that woman! Stop it!
Mary Mae.
Stop it! It doesn't matter who she is or what she's done. She is telling you the truth. did not kill Bradley Ward. I know it's the truth, and I will tell you why.
Order in the court. Any further outbursts, and I will clear this room.
Bailiff, remove the jury. Yes, Your Honor. The witness may step down.
What is going on? Does Grandma know something?
It looks that way.
Oh, Edward.
Are you all right?
Yes, dear. It's your father.
Looks like we're in for some 11th hour revelations.
You don't suppose Mary Mae's going to confess?
Oh, what, to murdering her own son? Don't be obscene. No, but look at the way Grandfather's watching her. Maybe he suspected something all along.
Everyone will be seated.
Your Honor,
Mrs. Ward, you're out of order. What's more, you've already testified.
I realize that, Your Honor, but there are things they didn't ask me because they didn't know. And I had hoped that this would not be necessary. But Edward Quartermain did not, could not have murdered my son. And may I tell you why?
Your Honor, are you going to allow this?
I will have order in this court.
Clearly, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by the defense to obfuscate the facts of this case. This woman has already testified. Why are we being subjected to this?
Mr. Schultz, I am not going to put up with your outbursts either. As it is, we are dangerously close to grounds for a mistrial. Counsel, approach the bench.
You suppose that Stannis was moving for a mistrial all along?
He looked just as surprised the rest of them.
What is this?
The whole truth. It's time.
I'm not about to agree to let her prejudice the jury with what might be a complete fiction.
I suggest we adjourn to chambers with Mrs. Ward and discover what this is about.
Your Honor, unless she's about to confess to the murder herself, I strongly object to her taking the stand again.
There's no point speculating till we speak with the woman. Court will adjourn for a brief recess. Mrs. Ward, will you join us in chambers?
Yes, Your Honor.
All rise. I can request to accompany you as your attorney.
That won't be necessary.
Mrs. Ward, will you come this way, please?
Mary Mae? No.
Edward, it's time.
Mrs. Ward, may I remind you, you're still under oath.
I'm going to let you say this in your own words. Please, tell the court what you just told us in chambers.
At 18 years old, I was a war widow. I was trying to make ends meet, singing in a nightclub outside Norfolk, Virginia, which catered to Navy enlisted men. I had a way with the blues. One night, young Navy lieutenant came in, and he took a table by himself. And that wasn't unusual, but I noticed the way he just listened. And I also noticed the way he kept coming back. And then finally one night, he came backstage and he introduced himself. And we went out for a drink. And we discovered that we had a way of relating to each other. We're two young people affected by a war, facing an uncertain future. But mostly it was the music that drew us together. So we became lovers, briefly. Then he was shipped overseas, and we corresponded for a while. And then I found out that I was pregnant. I wrote to him to to tell him this, and I said that I had no expectation of a future with him. I told him I was bringing his child into this world. He wrote back and said that he would offer any help he could. But I chose not to answer that letter, but I kept it. And when my son was born, I named him Bradley.
And when did you see Bradley's father again, face to face?
The night Bradley died. But most of it happened as I testified. Bradley came to see me, we talked, and then he went to lie down in his room, and I went to my own room. But I didn't undress. For a long while, I just lay there thinking and tried to come to terms with what I had to do. So I got the letter from his father, and I left the house.
And where did you go?
I went to the Port Charles apartment of Edward Quartermain.
What time did you arrive at Mr. Quartermain's apartment?
I don't know, around, well, it was before midnight, perhaps. I rang the bell, he opened the door, and I apologized to him for disturbing him. He didn't know who I was. I'm sorry to disturb you.
May I be of assistance?
You certainly may. I'm Bradley Ward's mother, Mary Mae Ward. Mary Mae Powers Ward?
I have no idea.
I realize that.
Please, come in.
My son came to me tonight, and he told me everything. I know all about Elizabeth Jackson, Kylie Quinlan, and the child they lost when someone ran them off the road. I also know what you and your friends are trying to do to him. But you are going to see to it that they leave him alone. This is why.
You kept the letter?
For 30 years, I've never shown this to anyone, not even Bradley. But I'm here to tell you that if you don't do what I ask, I am going to tell the whole world that Bradley Ward is your son. That night, Edward Quartermain found out he had another son. He had the proof. Edward could not, he would not have put a gun to his own son's head and murdered him in cold blood. Never.
Objection. Conclusion on the part of the witness.
Sustained. Stick to the facts, please, Mrs. Ward.
Mrs. Ward, what did you do when you left Edward Quartermain's that night?
I went home. Bradley was still lying across the bed, fully dressed, but I didn't stop and speak to him. I went to my room and I put on my night clothes. But I didn't sleep, not then. After a long while, I heard him go downstairs, make a phone call.
To whom?
I couldn't hear what he said, but I know he didn't come back upstairs. So I assumed that he was getting something to eat or sitting in the living room because he couldn't sleep. And I didn't think I could sleep either, but I did. And the next thing I know, I was awakened by what I now realize was a gunshot. I heard the second shot clearly. Right away, I knew it was bad. And I've described to you how I found his body. You can understand, knowing his frame of mind and finding the gun in his hand, how I thought he killed himself. So you can also understand how I blamed myself as I sat there holding him in my arms. If I had stopped in his room and told him the truth about his father, would it have ended differently? Even now, I wonder. I don't know how long I sat there. I got an old shovel. I went to the shed and dug his grave. It was the most I could do for him at that time, and I tried to do it right. And I laid his body very gently in their grave. And I said goodbye to him. I sat there with him, keeping him company until the sun rose. Then went into the house, got dressed, and I went to see Edward Quartermain again.
Oh, Mary Mae, I tried to do what you asked, but I'm afraid it may be out of my hands.
Yes, it is. And you can tell your friends that Bradley won't be a problem anymore. He's dead.
What?
By his own hand.
Oh, God.
And you don't have to worry about finding the body. All you can do for your son now is to ensure that the investigation won't destroy the very things he tried to protect by killing himself. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Leave him his good name for his sake, for the sake of his wife, for the sake of his children, your grandchildren. He did good work. People loved him. People believed in him. And he can't hurt you anymore, so just leave him alone.
We've heard testimony that Edward Quartermain did indeed use his influence to have the investigation terminated.
I'm sure he would. It was the least he could do.
Mrs. Ward, is there anything further you'd like to add?
No, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. That'll be all.
Mr. Schultz?
Well, certainly put a different perspective on things, Mrs. Ward. I have just one question. When you went to see Edward Quartermain that night and told him that Bradley Ward was his son, a secret with the potential to devastate the man's family and seriously compromise his business, isn't it possible that you actually gave Edward Quartermain strong enough motive for murder?
Objection, Your Honor, I object!
Order! If I thought Edward Quartermain directly caused the death of my son, I would have sent him straight to hell myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, look at the evidence. Why, not simply the evidence the prosecution has tried to present against Edward Quartermain, all of which is circumstantial, the evidence pointing away from him. It turns out that another man actually confessed 20 years ago to the murder of Bradley Ward. Unfortunately, he's dead. So we had to hear his confession secondhand from the woman to whom he'd made it at the time. But there's no question that Jack Boland could have done it. Let's consider the timetable. We know that shortly after midnight, Edward called his associates, Jack Boland, Lee Baldwin, and Frank Smith, to meet at Jack Boland's house, which they did at 1 o'clock that morning. Now, we know why Edward Quartermain convened that meeting. We've heard from Mary Mae Ward what she went to his apartment to tell him shortly before midnight. So Edward was trying to fulfill his promise to her, to stop them from hounding the man Edward had just learned was his own son. Now, we heard testimony from Lee Baldwin as to Edward Quartermain's distress at that meeting when the others refused to change tactics where Bradley Ward was concerned. Edward left Jack Boland's house, probably around 1:30. Then, we come to that phone call. Half an hour later. Now, Jack Boland said it was from Edward, saying Bradley had been dealt with. But we know Jack Boland was lying on the stand. He lied about his ties to organized crime. And we heard Mrs. Ward testify that Bradley was still alive at approximately that time that she heard him go downstairs and make a call to somebody. And Myrna Slaughter testified that Jack Boland told her Bradley had indeed called and asked to meet with Jack in the garden of the Ward house, where Jack Boland killed him with Edward's own gun, obtained for just such a contingency. But Jack Boland isn't on trial here today, is he? Now, he's answering to a much higher authority. Let's consider Edward Quartermain, a man deeply respected by this community and by his family, a man who worked hard all his life to deserve that respect. And let's consider his family, many of whom are sitting in this courtroom. They learned that they're related to Bradley Ward. A stunning revelation. Do you see any blame or remorse in any of their faces? No. Now, this is a family that takes the high road, a family that supports each other and respects old-fashioned values. Where did they learn it? Values are handed down from generation to generation. Now, you see, sitting here before you, a living example of Edward Quartermain's own values. And believe me, those aren't the values of a man who would take a gun and kill another man, let alone a man he just learned was his own flesh and blood, his own son. In fact, he was shocked when he learned from Mary Mae Ward early the next morning that Bradley was dead. And we know he did the only thing he could. He stopped the investigation of his son, an investigation that might have compromised the integrity of Bradley's work, even though that work went against Edward Quartermain's own interest. If the purpose was to remove Bradley as a threat, why not allow the man's reputation to be destroyed? Because Edward Quartermain had made a promise to the mother of his son. And now, we come to the most compelling thing of all. Bradley Ward's own mother is convinced of Edward Quartermain's innocence. Have you heard her moving testimony? Are any of you prepared to tell her she's wrong? Beyond a reasonable doubt?
Ladies and gentlemen, the defense is clearly trying to confuse the issue with a great deal of circumstantial evidence. It's an age-old tactic, and I trust that this jury is too smart to be manipulated in that way. Now, whether or not Jack Boland equivocated about his business associations is irrelevant, except to say that if he was a man given to bending the truth, then his entire story to Myrna Slaughter could well be a total fabrication. The defense has made much of the fact that Bradley Ward may have been alive when Jack Boland received a phone call from Edward saying that the Ward problem was over. Perhaps Jack Boland misunderstood. Perhaps Edward said that he would take care of the problem, and then he went to the Ward house and did just that. There certainly was a period of time during which Mary Mae Ward admits that she was asleep, where Edward could have gone to that house and had a showdown with Bradley Ward face to face. And that showdown could have resulted in Bradley Ward's death. And now we come to the crux of the matter. Why was Bradley Ward killed? He'd been a thorn in the side of a number of people for quite some time. So much so that 4 men took it upon themselves to dig up enough dirt to derail young Ward's career, perhaps permanently. They didn't need to kill him. So what happened? What was suddenly different? What occurred that night that sealed Bradley Ward's death warrant? You know what happened. You just heard Mary Mae Ward testify to it. She went to Edward Quartermain with proof that he had fathered his own worst political enemy by a black woman. This was 1974, remember. Now, the defense spoke really quite eloquently about the Quartermain family tradition. What do you think this would have done to that family's hallowed image? And there's something of greater significance to consider here. Mary Mae Ward, for all intents and purposes, tried to blackmail Edward Quartermain into removing the threat from their son. She said to him, "I will tell the world." After she left his apartment that night, what went through Edward's mind? One can imagine him pacing the floor, conjuring scenarios of repeated threats to reveal Bradley's parentage, to keep Edward in line. Years of potential blackmail stretching ahead. He couldn't be sure that Mary Mae Ward wouldn't tell her son the truth. And how might Bradley Ward use that information? It was an untenable position for a man used to controlling his own destiny. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Edward Quartermain saw only one way out of this bind. Perhaps he justified it by his desire to protect his family, emotionally and financially. Perhaps he went to see young Ward with no intention of killing him. And perhaps Bradley Ward, upon suddenly learning such an earth-shaking truth, said or did something that confirmed Edward's worst fears. And in the heat of the moment, Edward Quartermain acted. The fact remains, Bradley Ward was shot and killed that night. Who had the strongest, most desperate motive? Who had opportunity? Who has proven himself over the years capable of doing whatever it takes to further his own interests and that of his family? You know the answer. There is only one way justice can be served in this case. Bring back a verdict of guilty as charged. Thank
Oh, Lord, what have I done?
Several people other than the defendant have been implicated in this matter. Now, it is not incumbent upon you to decide their guilt or innocence. Your sole job is to decide whether the state has proved beyond a reasonable doubt its case against the defendant. You may begin your deliberations. Court is adjourned.
All rise.
Well, you did your best.
Reasonable doubt. That's all we needed to give them.
True.
Let's get out of here.
Mrs. Ward, will you join us back at the house, you and Keisha, and Edward's new grandson?
Yes, we will.
Mrs. Ward, give us a comment.